If you think a quiet trail at night is harmless, think again. These are 6 reported encounters, dramatic retellings of what people said they lived through, that make a single warning hard to ignore. Don't hike alone after dark. A quick note before we begin. These are reported accounts, dramatized for effect. The word skinwalker appears in a few of the stories. It originates in Navajo tradition and is used here only descriptively for behaviors people compared to shape-shifting or mimicry. None of these experiences is being presented as proven fact. They are accounts, sometimes supported by odd traces, and they change the lives of the people who told them. He ran the county's night patrol for 7 years. When he told me the story, he still had the white scar on his knuckle from where he jammed his hand into a barbed wire fence to slow himself down. I'll call him Marcus. It was late October, the kind of cold that steals warmth from bone. Marcus had been following a car that shouldn't have been on the old mill road. The headlights cutting across slick black pavement, slowing behind every dip and turning as if someone was trying to learn the layout by feel. He radioed his dispatcher once, then again. No response. The car pulled the way people pull into bad places. A sudden jog onto an unmarked side lane that ended at a battered gate and a cemetery you could see only when the fog thinned. He parked 10 yards back, engine low, and watched. The lot's single sodium light made everything look the color of old teeth. The car idled. 2 people sat inside. Then a third figure walked from the tree line and climbed into the back seat without the door snapping the way it should. No metal scrape, no soft thump. Marcus told himself it was a trick of distance, adrenaline. He turned the cruiser onto the lane and followed. The road narrowed into gravel. The radio hissed. The headlight beam carved a path between leaning cedars. The car ahead stopped at the dead end. Its taillights flared like a warning, and then the headlights for a moment were pointed straight at Marcus. He saw 3 silhouettes get out and stand, still, as if they'd been frozen mid-breath. One leaned on a headstone. For a second, a thought passed through Marcus that he'd walked into a funeral party. Then the nearest figure took a step that no human step should take. It was too long, too slow. Its knees bent wrong, under arms that were too long for its frame. He called out through the open window to make himself known. Nobody answered. The 2 passengers lifted from the car, slow like they were made of water. The third figure, taller, gaunter, slipped between the headstones and vanished. The sound dropped away. Insects that usually chirped from the grass went silent. Marcus's breath made a white cloud that broke in the motionless air. He left the cruiser and followed the footprints. He found them almost immediately. A line of impressions in the soft shoulder chalked by the fog. Too deep for a boot, too long for a human foot. They ran a loop. They came close to where Marcus stood in the open and then turned away in a perfect circle. He crouched, fingers trembling to take a photograph with his phone. The mud there was raw, collapsed edges like something heavy had pressed down and lingered where a heel should have left a print. He could smell something under the frost, a wet metallic tang that made him think of decay and a hunger that wasn't his own. He heard a footstep then, very close. Not a crunch on gravel, but a soft, deliberate pad. He swung his flashlight, and there, 10 feet away, perfectly still, was a long-limbed shape, its shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight. The light hit it, and for a blinding second, Marcus saw a face that was both too human and wrong. Stretched tight over bone, dark hollows where cheeks should be. Then the shape folded sideways between 2 stones and was gone. He ran, not heroically, just a single pure motion away from something that had the patience of hunger. He reached the cruiser, locked the doors, and sat with the engine running until dawn. The car that had stopped at the cemetery that night was not at the dead end when he looked back in daylight. There were no tire tracks linking it to the road. The prints he photographed were gone by morning, washed away where the ground had frozen hard under a thin rime. He handed the photos to his sergeant. They were grainy and odd, but they were there. People at the station shrugged them off, then looked at him differently when he asked for a transfer to day shift. After that shift, he'd stopped sleeping for stretches. He quit the night patrol within a month. He tried not to say the name of what he'd seen. In his reports, he used words like unidentified person and possible vagrant. At home, he kept a small flashlight on the kitchen counter and refused to take the dog on walks after dusk. Friends who'd known him for years noticed he walked the edges of rooms as if listening for steps only he could hear. This first account leans toward attributes people associate with a Wendigo: gaunt, unnaturally long limbs, bare footprints that were almost impossible to match to any boot, an oppressive cold, and the sense of being watched by hunger itself. Marcus insisted the figures had not been human in the ordinary sense. He also insisted he hadn't wanted to believe that. He said the cemetery night felt like stepping into a place where time had rearranged itself. If you're new here and like true encounter compilations, subscribe for more stories like this. It helps us keep collecting and dramatizing accounts like Marcus's. There's a different kind of stillness, one that doesn't drag you toward hunger, but that imitates normalcy so well you have to ask if you saw it at all. That's how the second story begins.
Avery was 19, home alone the first semester of college, and working on a paper late into a damp November night. She lived in a duplex, back door to a small wood deck, a cheap plastic chair that had cracked in the center but still held shape. She kept the porch light on, the cheap kind of yellow that makes every shadow look like it's been cut from gray cloth. The neighborhood was the kind where you could hear a truck 2 blocks over and know whether it was the dump or someone hauling furniture. That night, there was a truck in the distance and an odd silence closer in. She glanced up from her laptop and saw a man sitting in the plastic chair on her back deck. He wasn't leaning back and laughing, he was just sitting. He wore dark clothes. His hands lay on his knees. The porch light made a hard circle around him. She thought it might be one of the neighbors at first, some older guy who liked to sit outside and smoke. She slid open the door and called out, "Hey, can I help you?" The man did not move. She closed the door quietly, locked it, and ducked down behind the couch, thinking of calling out again. When she peered out the curtain 10 minutes later, the chair was empty. No footprints, no bent grass. If anything, the night seemed to hold its breath. She told her mother when she got off the phone with her friend. The mother drove around the block in her car and knocked on a few doors. A neighbor 2 houses down said she'd seen a man in dark clothing out there for a while, but that he left when she grinned at him and turned the porch light toward him. A ring camera on a neighbor's stoop showed nothing, just static at the time the man had supposedly sat there. Avery installed a bright lamp on the back step the next evening. She slept with the light on for a week. Months later, hiking alone on a trailside cabin weekend after finals, she woke early and walked out in the last blue of pre-dawn to clear her head. Across a small clearing, someone sat on a log, facing the fire circle of an abandoned campsite. They were perfectly still. Avery should have kept walking. She didn't. She saw the person move their head that tiny fraction as if listening. Then they turned toward her in perfect unison. Their face? Blank, like a plaster cast. The hair was plaster smooth, the eyes dull. It was as if someone had taken the shape of a person and removed the story from them. Her feet made no sound. The person stood slowly. It didn't walk. It tilted its head and then took a step that was slightly offbeat, too deliberate, and the bark beneath their boot made no scrape. When Avery ran, the figure didn't follow. When she glanced back, it was gone, and the campsite smelled like bonfire ash and detergent, an ordinary smell that didn't match the way her stomach tightened. Neighbors' cameras later showed footage of a figure sitting on the back deck that night. Except in one frame, the face looked like the teenage cousin Avery had described to her mother, and in the next frame, the face was blurred into something like the plastic of an action figure. One of the frames was missing audio. The neighbor admitted the camera sometimes froze. No one had an answer. Avery said the term skinwalker came up in a forum thread where someone else described watching a person stand motionless for an hour on their porch and then simply be gone. She used the word as shorthand to explain what she felt: mimicry, stillness, and that flat, blank stare that seemed copied from a mannequin. She stopped hiking alone. She traded night walks for daylight errands. She replaced the back deck chair with a ceramic planter and stopped leaving the back door unlocked. The culprit could have been a harmless drifter, a prank, someone casing houses, or an optical glitch in a faulty camera. Or it could have been what she felt it was, a thing that sits and watches and learns how to look human. The accounts don't have to decide which to be true for them to be terrifying. The next account comes from a couple who checked into a small backcountry lodge off a forestry road. The lodge was 50 miles from the nearest town, the kind of place where new mattresses still smell like cedar, and the coffee is a black, strong thing kept hot in a pot on a counter. The wife, I'll call her Jenna, told me the story. They were exhausted after a day on the ridge and went to bed early. At 2 in the morning, her partner, a tall man who had never raised his voice in 8 years of marriage, screamed. Jenna bolted up and ran down the hallway to room 9. The door was ajar. The light from the corridor painted the doorway in a thin gold. She pushed the door wider and found her partner on the floor, clutching his shoulder. He had no visible wounds, just the look of someone who had been winded and shocked. He said a woman had attacked him. He'd say later that she looked like someone he knew from town, someone he worked with in summers before Jenna had met him. But when Jenna and the lodge manager pulled the hallway cameras and the lobby feed the next morning, the footage offered something stranger than a simple assault. On the security video, a figure enters the lobby and walks past the corridor that leads to room 9. At first glance, it's a woman. Her hair swings. She moves like someone carrying a grocery bag. At the 1-second mark, when the frame blinks and stutters, the face looks wrong. Features shifting subtly, like a heat shimmer that makes straight things wobble. In one frame, she looks middle-aged. The next, she looks very young. In an even earlier frame, the outline of a mask can be seen, an odd fold near the cheek, as if someone had pulled something over their features and may have adjusted it between steps. The footage then glitches for 2 seconds. Audio drops out. When the sequence resumes, the same corridor shows a figure leaving in a different coat entirely. The manager swore someone else had checked in that night, but the registry shows no name. The man who had been attacked was lucid enough to tell officers there was no time for a mask. The hallway was narrow and the attack was quick. The lodge's outside camera showed footprints in the gravel that led up to the porch and then vanished at the steps as if someone stepped off the ground. Police interviewed the couple and the manager. An employee said she'd seen a person sitting on the front steps earlier that evening, perfectly still, and had waved at them. The person had not responded. There were no fingerprints found on the inside of the doorframe, but an old bolt latch on room 9's door had been taped in such a way that the door could be opened from the outside without tripping the sensor the lodge installed the following week. The tape was the only obvious sign someone had forced or manipulated the door, though the tape itself left no identifying marks. In the weeks after, guests reported the TV in room 9 would sometimes flicker, showing static that shaped itself into the outline of faces for a breath before resolving back into snow. Jenna stopped sleeping soundly. Her partner, once jocular and unbothered, would startle at creaks and swears he heard on the radio that weren't there. The sheriff closed the file with an assault, unknown suspect, and local gossip called it an attempted robbery. The video was inconclusive. The manager left the lodge 6 months later. The lodge story fits more cleanly into what people label skinwalker-leaning behavior. Mimicry, a figure that appears human then slips between identities, cameras that capture impossible anomalies. But the footage could mean any number of things: a bad recording, an actor playing tricks, someone with an agenda. The couple's aftermath was concrete. They sold their mountain home and never returned to that road after sunset. It's worth noticing a pattern that threads through the first 3 accounts: silence at the edges of natural noise, figures that stay still until they don't, prints or tape that don't match ordinary explanations, and cameras that tell a story different from what the eye remembers. Each narrator left something behind when they walked away, not necessarily proof, but traces that made walking back into the ordinary world impossible. The 4th account begins on the edge of industrial and wild. He was meeting a stranger to buy a headlamp and a sleeping pad, gear for a hike he'd planned for the next morning. The advertisement had said, "Pick up near river access, evening okay." And he'd assumed normalcy, $5 exchanged, a quick goodbye. The real world often operates that way. We assume civility will show up in exchange. He called the number at dusk. The man told him to come to a trailhead parking lot near an old Navy yard where chain-link fences ironed the last light into a horizon of rust. The lot was empty when he pulled in. Cracked asphalt, a few salt-stiffened weeds, a single lamppost with a bulb that hummed. He parked under it. The seller was a silhouette against a shipping container, too thin to match the bulky jacket he'd mentioned on the phone. The seller's hands held the lamp and pad like props. They made small talk. The seller asked why he'd be hiking alone at night. He said it was practice. The seller laughed, a sound like a bottle scraped across teeth. They haggled. The seller turned away to fetch the pad from the trunk of a car he'd parked oddly close to the pedestrian barrier. When the buyer reached the car, a blow landed at the base of his skull so quick he saw nothing of the attacker's face. He went black on the asphalt. When he came to, there were police around him, lights making everything blue. The lamp and pad were gone. The only things in his pocket were a few coins and a concrete grit that smelled of diesel. One officer handed him a small white evidence bag with a lamp's light bulb inside that had been retrieved from the scene, coated in a dust that looked like ash. The officers said other cruisers had been called about a disturbance. When they arrived, there had been a vehicle, but no number plate, and the man who'd been seen in the lot had left on foot toward the shipping containers. Witnesses were inconsistent. Someone said they'd seen 3 people walk away. Another said only 1. Footprints near the place where the man was knocked out were muddled, as if many individuals had stomped through the area the same night. He gave a statement. The police noted a surveillance camera on a nearby warehouse had recorded a 6-second clip of a figure standing under the lamppost before the recorded frames glitched. In the frames that survived, the figure was small and barefoot, though the man who had attacked him had worn a boot earlier on the lot. The officers thought perhaps someone had tried to mug him. They did a sweep for prints and found no shoe tread, but a pattern of long, shallow depressions in the muddy sod beyond the fence, spaced strangely, almost like someone who had walked with a predatory gait. He never hiked that trail alone again. The lamp's bulb in the evidence bag would not light when he took it home and tried to screw it into another socket, though when he held it near his face, he said it made him feel watched. He sold the porch light at a yard sale 2 months later and moved the next month to another town. The police file sat in a drawer until it became part of the station's cold cases emailed around for training. This tale straddles a line.
It begins like an ordinary crime scenario, a scam or robbery gone wrong, but it collects odd details that refuse tidy closure. A lamp that feels wrong, footprints that don't belong to boots, a camera glitch that freezes identity. The accounts all acknowledge that one plausible reading is criminal intent, but the details nudge the mind into another direction, a presence that enjoys the edge between uncanny and ordinary. At this point, the woods have closed like a hand around the throat of the night. The stories pile on each other, a gaunt shape slipping between headstones, a figure sitting on a back deck with the stubborn patience of something that does not age, a lodge camera that refuses to show a continuous face, and a seller at the edge of industrial light who vanishes before the police can pin him down. Each tale leaves a certain residue in the days afterward: mistrust, altered routines, new locks, and the small rituals of people learning how to live with what may not be explainable. There's more to these reports, deeper into the woods, closer to the firelight. The next 2 accounts pull tighter on that dread. One is a camping story with prints that ring tense like a curse. The other is a park security report where a man stands at a gate and then appears behind the very doors that should have kept him out. Both end with small, stubborn clues. Both ended people's willingness to be alone at night. He tells the story like this. They were 3 friends, Mark, Jason, and the narrator, out for a weekend with nothing but a map of old logging trails and a determination to leave the noise of town behind. The burn area they chose was out beyond marked signage, a stretch of pines where the soil held the scent of sap and the air sat cool in late August. They set the tents in a small clearing and kept the fire low. The first night they laughed. The second night, something paced just beyond the light. At first, it was a sound you could almost rationalize, a branch snapping, a deer testing the smell of the camp. Then the sound condensed into 4 slow, heavy steps that circled the tents. Each time the sound passed, it matched the rhythm of someone walking on the soft earth, except that when one of the friends flung the flap and swept a flashlight out, there was only darkness and a pressure in the air like someone closing a lid. The animals that should have filled the fringe of night made no sound at all. They chalked it up to being jumpy. By the third night, they were exhausted. The one who woke first, Jason, stepped out to pee, and finished when he noticed the odor, something like musk and wet fur, and then the cold. He saw the prints then, lined up in a ring around the tents. They were enormous, too long for boots, bare footprints with long, splayed toes and deep arches that marked down into the earth. Each print was spaced in a way that made the circle complete, and that matched the slow, patient pacing they'd heard the night before. One set of prints led away from the ring, toward the tree line, then vanished. They packed in the dawn and left, coffee forgotten. No one argued. The police who came with a commuter from town took photographs. A biologist friend later looked at the images and shrugged, saying perhaps a pair of someone's old boots could leave odd impressions in the loose pine duff. But the pattern of the prints, smudged edges like claws, long stride spacing that suggested an abnormal leg proportion, made the friends swallow hard every time they told the story. They didn't camp for a full year after. One friend moved away. The narrator took a job with a day schedule and stopped answering invites to midnight ridge hikes. This is the purest Wendigo-leaning vignette in the set. Barefoot tracks circling a camp, a smelling of cold and hunger, pacing that feels like stalking. It thrives on that sensorial detail that erases comfort, the lack of nocturnal insects, the scent at the edge, the deep, wrong prints in the earth. The 3 left a piece of themselves behind the first dawn after they saw the ring of prints. They didn't need to see the creature to know something had circled their sleep. One story remains in this sequence that tips back into mimicry and impossible access before we step out of the woods and into the place where security cameras and locked doors supposedly protect us. A park ranger, night shift, middle-aged, living alone in a cabin near the main trailhead, told me about a figure who stood at the gate like a statue for nearly an hour. The ranger had a routine: check the lot, check the bathrooms, sweep the trailheads. That night, the sky was clear, the moon hung like a coin. The gate's motion sensor threw up a small ring of light whenever a car approached, and at 2:03 a.m., the lamp near the kiosk flicked as if responding to an unseen pulse. He saw the man from 30 feet, 10, then 5. The figure stood on the other side of the gate, arms at his side, head down. He wore a coat pulled tight. The ranger's light washed over him and the man did not move. Not a blink, not a shift. He was the sort of stillness that felt deliberate. The ranger called out, "You okay?" The man did not so much as turn his head. The ranger walked his usual loop. When he returned, the man was now inside the gate, standing 10 feet from the kiosk. The ranger's hand hovered on his radio. He stepped up and asked for identification. The man's mouth made no sound when it opened. The guard felt a prickle straight up his spine. Then, as if a curtain were pulled, the man walked through the locked door of the maintenance shed in the ranger's peripheral vision. The shed's alarm should have tripped, but it did not. The ranger kicked the door hard, and it yielded. The latch had been taped in a way that a person from the inside could open it, but there had been no sign anyone had been inside. Officers arrived. They swept the grounds. On the path to the maintenance room, they found long, shallow depressions in the soil. Again, the odd spacing that made the ranger feel like something had been taking exaggerated strides. Inside the shed, a discarded glove. Nothing else.
There were no prints on the door handle. The man had simply vanished. Afterwards, the ranger changed shift patterns. He began checking his vehicle's trunk before he parked it. He added a motion-activated light to the path. He left the park for a week, and when he came back, something in the night felt as if it had learned to keep distance. He wasn't sure he'd ever get used to a shadow that waited for him to notice it before moving to a place where it should not have been able to go. Stop for a moment and listen to what these accounts do to how you think about darkness. They do not target the dramatic. They aim at the ordinary, trails, porches, lodge corridors, then show how the expected rules bend. A gate that fails to keep something out, an empty chair that isn't empty when you blink, prints that do not match boots, video frames that cannot be explained. Each narrator walks away with at least one physical clue that resists tidy answers. Each one makes a small, sensible alteration in life. New lights, new locks, a different schedule. I'll tell you this, I spoke to people who now sleep with a radio low on their nightstand. They drive out of parking lots with doors locked. Some carry more than a flashlight. Some won't go to certain trails at night at all. The point isn't to stoke paranoia. It's to show how darkness changes us, and how often the world around us doesn't help when that change happens. The night thickens farther in. A trailhead where industrial metal meets pine. A cabin where a camera's frames alter the order of faces. 3 tents with a ring of prints around them. A ranger who watches a man walk into a locked shed. These are the stories that make up the first half of the set I gathered. Each one carries uncertainty like an extra weight. We have 2 more before the list completes, both closing the loop on how the night corrodes ordinary safety. One more that begins with a cellar at the lot and ends in a lamp bulb passed back as evidence. And the final account from a lone security guard who confronts a figure that appears and disappears through locked doors. But before I tell those, listen. Notice the pattern that keeps recurring. The beings or people or events in these accounts do not behave like criminals. They do not always leave clear human marks. They exploit thresholds, doorways, porches, the edge of a campfire's light. Cameras refuse to be simple witnesses. Footprints, when they appear, are wrong in a small but crucial way. And the after effect on the people involved isn't a thirst for proof. It's a narrowing of the world. Fewer late walks, more attention to daylight schedules, a permanent reluctance to be alone outside when the stars are out. There's a question that sits under all of this. What do you do if you find yourself suddenly and without warning alone in the dark with something that does not follow the rules? Practical answers exist. Stick to well-lit trails, tell someone your route, carry a charged phone, never go alone, but they feel thin when laid over the kinds of persistent, ambiguous traces these people brought back with them. And yet, there is no evidence in any of these files to justify an either-or conclusion. No lab declared a supernatural cause, no tribunal assigned a verdict that turned night hikes into a felony. What we have are reports, photographs, and footage that do not settle. Sometimes the unexplainable is enough to make people change their lives. When I met the man who had been selling gear at the Navy Yard, met him much later in a dim diner where his hands shook and he watched the windows like a hawk, he told me something that stopped me. "You think you're alone out there," he said quietly, folding his coffee cup in both hands as if trying to warm them. "But sometimes the thing that's watching is just waiting to see how you move when it decides you're worth learning." We'll pick up from the edge of that parking lot and finish the last 2 accounts next. The next stories go deeper into the camping site where footprints ringed the tents, and into the park's maintenance shed where a man stood at the gate and then was inside the building without setting off any alarms. These are the ones that hit closest to the idea of don't hike alone at night in a way that stays with you. We'll pick up at that lot, at the one with the cracked asphalt and the humming lamppost, and follow the thin threads left behind by people who went home with too many questions and not enough answers. After the police handed him the little evidence bag with the lamps bulb, the man who'd been knocked out tried to treat the thing like a closed event.
He returned to work, he said the right words to friends who asked, and he bought another headlamp at a big box store with a receipt he kept folded in his wallet. But at night, when the town went quiet, he found himself tracing the edge of his windows with the beam from his phone, like checking the seams of a tent. The bulb sat in a sock drawer, dull and dirty, the metal base coated in a gray residue he couldn't explain. Once he showed it to a friend who worked at the university's materials lab. The friend took it from him with a practiced, skeptical look, ran a quick microscopy check, and came back the next day with nothing decisive. No biological trace, no obvious coating that catalogs in a lab book. Could be ash, she said, hedging. Could be road dust. That answer felt like a denial and a confirmation at once. Months later, the man told me he dreamt of footprints. Long and wrong, not his boots, but long depressions that marched slowly in a ring and then dissolved into fog.
He woke with the taste of metal in his mouth and the sense that the thing that hit him had learned something about him. He sold his hiking gear. He stopped answering ads for gear pickups. The police file went cold in a box. People at the station told him some muggings happen in that lot. That made sense until it did not. He learned to distrust the neatness of either explanation. Marcus, the county night patrolman, kept a copy of his Prince photos on an old phone he would not let anyone else hold. On certain nights, when the house felt too silent, he'd thumb through the grainy images and watch the way light fell on collapse lines in mud, the way frost blurred the edges of the depressions so they looked like bruises. He took a job at a vending company during the day, cash that helped him keep the lights on and keep the nights as far from his house as possible. He said the transfer helped, but only in the practical sense. He no longer trusted the dark in the way he once had. Not at the cemetery, not on the back roads, not even in his dreams. When a trainee asked him once, half joking, whether he believed in monsters, Marcus shrugged and said, "Only in how they teach you to move." Avery's change was quieter, internal. She burned out of school one spring and took a job at a bookstore where her shifts started in daylight. She said it wasn't fear for fear's sake, so much as a new, constant attention to the way people position themselves in rooms. She began to notice when a stranger in a cafe sat too still, when a porch light stayed on long after guests left. The neighbor's ring camera footage, the frame where a face looked wrong and then melted into blur, she kept on a hard drive that she sometimes would connect to her laptop and watch for the sake of ritual. The frame that bothered her most hadn't provided proof. It had provided a fracture in how she felt the world behaved. On some nights, she would find herself checking the back deck, even when the house was empty, looking for the hush of someone sitting like a statue. She changed the lock. She replaced the cracked plastic chair with a heavy stone planter. Those were small acts, practical and stubborn, the kind of changes that add up into a life repositioned around a single, unpunished moment. Jenna and her partner moved out of that mountain road almost a year after the lodge incident. They sold the place to someone who liked the idea of project work, and the manager who'd once sworn he'd seen a person sit motionless on the steps took a job at a chain restaurant in a different county. The lodge kept a thin reputation. A few brave hikers still stopped on weekend runs, and the manager still joked about souvenirs from room 9 when telling newcomers not to put wet boots on the carpet. Jenna's partner, though, did not joke anymore. He would sometimes catch himself scanning video thumbnails on his phone for a human face and then stop himself, as if the act would invite whatever had stormed the corridors back inside their home. They installed a new lock and a small alarm on the front door. They sold the old TV and bought a flat-screen model that never quite did the trick when static came up on late-night channels. The static, Jenna told me, would sometimes coalesce in her memory into the shape of a face just long enough for her to feel watched. The sheriff called it an assault of unknown origin and filed the report under a standard category. The form fit the facts, but not the residual skein of doubt. The three friends, the ones who left the campsite with the ring of horror in their wake, did something different. Mark took a job that kept him inside and sane.
He began working nights at a printing plant where a building's humming felt at least orderly. Jason moved away to the city and started sleeping with a small white noise machine because he said the constant mechanical sound drowned the echo of the thing pacing outside his tent. The narrator of that night, who had once loved the way a sleeping bag folded into a life, sold his old tent in a classified ad and kept the photo of the prints in his phone as if to remind himself what he'd been spared from continuing to be. They argued once about whether they should go back with a ton of bright lights and photographers in tow, to prove nothing. The idea made them laugh once, a brittle laugh that dissolved into something like agreement, some lines you never cross again. The park ranger who watched the man at the gate changed his patrol route permanently. The tape on the shed's latch, the glove that stayed behind, the shallow depressions in the soil that the officer photographed, those were small things that never cohered into a narrative that felt satisfying. The ranger told me he still checked the shed 3 times a night, even though the alarm never tripped and the cameras showed nothing when he reviewed footage. Sometimes he'd sit in his truck and wait, if only to practice patience. He told his supervisor he couldn't help the way the hair on his arms stood up sometimes, and the supervisor nodded with the same mix of concern and pragmatic distance you give an employee who's had a tough shift. A few months later, the ranger requested day duty. The request was granted. He kept the light on along the kiosk's path. He put reflective strips on his jacket. He did what he could and left some things to the possible. Across these accounts, there's a pattern of evidence that refuses tidy closure. Photographs that are grainy and ambiguous. Camera frames that glitch into faces and then retreat into visual noise. Footprints that are long, raw, and do not match shoes. Small objects, tape, bulbs, gloves, that have been left behind and archived with no conclusive trace.
These physical traces perform the same function. They anchor a story enough that the people involved cannot simply dismiss what they experienced as a bad night. But they do not complete the story. They leave a margin, and that margin matters. It is the part where fear lives, where practical life meets inexplicable phenomena and does not know what to do. I ask each person, Marcus, Avery, Jenna and her partner, the guy from the Navy Yard lot, the 3 campers, and the ranger, what changed for them in the months that followed. Pragmatically, the answers clustered around the same small set of human responses. Change schedules, install lights, carry a working phone, walk in groups. Psychologically, the answers looked like thresholds: sleeping with a radio, refusing to be alone on a trail at night, selling property, less laughter. There were more intangible shifts too. A heightened attention to how people sat in rooms, a new habit of checking door frames at dusk, an internal map where certain roads were bordered in red. But there were subtler things too, signs not in police reports but in behavior. Mark, who once loved solitude, took a part-time job where he interacted with coworkers. He said people who have regular small talks anchor you back to normal. Jason started a routine of calling his mother every time he took a night bus. Marcus stopped smiling the way he used to, the edges of his mouth turned down in photographs. Jenna took to sleeping in a single lighted room because it made the static on the TV less convincing at night. The ranger, who once prided himself on solitary checks, began texting a colleague when his route felt, to him, wrong. There are other threads too. Online discussions where strangers exchange frames from doorbell cams and analyze the way a shoulder looks wrong in a single pixel. A forum where someone who used skinwalker as shorthand cautions that the term belongs to a culture and should be treated with care. That caution is important. The term skinwalker carries cultural weight and origin. It comes from Navajo tradition and has meanings and contexts far beyond the way it's sometimes used in online storytelling. In these retellings, the term was used descriptively, by witnesses trying to find language for mimicry and unnatural stillness. It's not used here as a claim of cultural authority or as a literal endorsement of any specific indigenous practice.
That line matters because language that borrows pain or spiritual concepts without context can harm real people and traditions. We use the term only to convey the behaviors witnesses compared to shapeshifting or mimicry, not to tell anyone's sacred story. If you step back and look at the list, cemetery chase, back deck sitter, lodge CCTV, Navy Yard meetup, camping ring of prints, park watcher, you begin to see a grammar of nighttime encounters. They happen at thresholds, where road becomes trail, where porch light ends and dark begins, where a gate should keep something from stepping across. The things in these accounts exploit that threshold. They either stand perfectly still long enough for your brain to normalize them, or they leave marks that don't fit any known shoe. Cameras record them and then refuse to show them consistently. People report the after effects not as the search for a trophy, but as changes, a narrowing of options, a reweaving of daily life. What do you do if you find yourself in one of those thresholds? There are the obvious precautions, the ones most survival guides will give. Don't hike alone at night. Tell someone your route. Carry a reliable light and a charged phone. Stay on marked trails and avoid isolated parking lots if you can. Those are the first-line defenses. But beyond those practicalities, these accounts suggest another layer, the power of habit and the value of being seen. When you go into a place alone at night, you remove many of the negotiated social rules that keep strangers visible to each other. A group of campers around a fire shares light, sight lines, and the ability to speak up. On a porch, a neighbor's footstep, a garage door slamming, or the click of a lock matters because it anchors the sequence of events to human activity. When none of those signals are present, or when they are present and yet something else occupies the edge of light, the human response is to shrink the world, to make smaller circles that are easier to protect. So here are practical, real-world actions drawn from what people actually did after their encounters. They are not miraculous guarantees. They are measures that made the people in these stories feel safer and that reduce the chances of being isolated at night. Avoid solo night hikes whenever possible. The simple presence of another person changes the dynamic of any space. Night amplifies risk by thinning the number of witnesses. If you must be out after dark, share your route and expected return time with someone you trust. Include details like trail names and checkpoints. Use a real-time location sharing app if you can. Keep a reliable, bright headlamp and a backup light. Headlamps are practical because they leave your hands free. A lighted presence makes you harder to approach unseen. Choose well-traveled, marked trails and avoid deserted access lots for transactions. Meet people in public places with other people around. If you're buying gear, meet in daylight or in a well-lit public place. Carry a whistle and know that sustained noise often attracts attention more reliably than a flashlight. Whistles are small, legal, and effective at calling for help from a distance. If you encounter someone behaving oddly, sitting motionless on a porch, standing at a gate and not responding, keep a safe distance and call local non-emergency dispatch to report a suspicious person.
Do not confront alone unless your retreat is blocked and you have no alternative. Trust your instincts. Several people in these accounts left before an uncomfortable situation escalated, and that decision protected them. Early avoidance is not cowardice, it's prudence. Consider simple environmental changes around your home, motion sensor lights, sturdy locks, and neighbor networks where you check in with each other. Small actions can restore psychological ground. Preserve evidence if you can safely do so. Photos of footprints from a distance, time-stamped video, notes about the precise time of the encounter. But do not put yourself in harm's way to record something. These actions are the sort of measures the people in these stories adopted because they worked on a human level. They didn't prove anything, they simply re-established a sense of agency in a world that had become, briefly, ambiguous. There is also a broader social thread here: how communities treat reports that do not fit clean narratives. Some of the people who told me these stories were met with roll eyes. Others found a surprising amount of support in forums where strangers trade experiences. The police, when involved, usually pursued mundane leads first, because that is what most evidence points to more often than not. In a few cases, local reporters wrote small pieces that kept the stories alive and returned to them months later as a curiosity. For some narrators, the most chilling part was not the encounter itself so much as the way life continued around them with only modest adjustments. Time did not pause to investigate the impossible. It moved forward, and the witnesses had to carry their unresolved images through the days that followed. That, perhaps, is why many of these accounts have such staying power. They do not demand a conclusion. They invite you to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. That space between the seen and the explainable reshapes behavior more effectively than a definitive answer could. The man who was chased into the cemetery quit the night patrol. The woman who found a man on her deck stopped walking at dusk. The couple who woke to a scream in a lodge sold their mountain place. The 3 campers who found a ring of prints packed up at dawn and didn't look back. Those choices are practical validations of a single premise, that sometimes it is safer to change your life than to solve the inexplicable. I will be honest, part of what makes these stories so intoxicating is how they let us test fear safely. We hear them from the safety of a lit screen, perhaps in the half-light of our living rooms, and we imagine the snap of a twig near our tent or the hush on a porch. That's part of the reason I collect these accounts. People tell me because they want to be heard. They want someone to take the pattern seriously, even if nothing can be proven. There is power in being believed, even in small doses.
Before I close, I want to make something clear about language and culture. The use of the word skinwalker in some of these accounts is a witness's attempt to characterize mimicry, behaviors where a presence appears human, then unmasks or changes form in footage or memory. The term, however, is part of Navajo spiritual vocabulary and tradition. It is not a casual nickname to be applied without understanding. When accounts borrow that word, they do so because it conveys a specific sense of shape-shifting mimicry. They do not, in these retellings, intend to speak for Navajo beliefs or practices. Respect for that boundary matters. Now, the last thing I'll say is this. Darkness doesn't invent danger, it concentrates it. A trail at night is not inherently haunted or cursed. Most nights pass without incident. Most people arrive where they intended to go. But the 6 accounts we've listened to share the same structural lesson. Wherever thresholds thin, porches, trailheads, parking lots, your vulnerability increases. The rule these stories agree on is simple and practical. Don't go into those thresholds alone if you can help it. If you take away one thing from these accounts, let it be this. Small changes make a difference. Walk with someone, share your plans, carry light, keep your phone charged. If you encounter behavior that feels wrong, someone who stands too still, footsteps that don't fit any shoe, a camera frame that blinks into another face, treat it like the kind of anomaly that deserves distance and a witness. The witnesses in these stories did not all seek confrontation. They acted to preserve themselves and to make sure they could keep living in the daylight. If you've ever had an encounter on a trail, at a campsite, or at a remote parking lot, something that left you unsettled or changed the way you move at night, I want to hear about it. Tell your story in the comments below. Be precise about time and place only if you're safe doing so, and know that staying anonymous is perfectly fine. Which of these 6 stories felt most like something you might have seen? Vote in the comments and tell us why. If you're new here and these kinds of reported encounters interest you, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss future collections. We gather these accounts because people tell them and because there's value in listening, not to sensationalize, but to prepare. And if you want more videos like this, check the playlist linked in the description where we dig into similar encounters and the strange traces they leave behind. Walk with a light. Tell someone where you're going. Don't make thresholds smaller than they have to be. Night is older than any one of us, and sometimes it keeps things that don't behave by daylight's rules. For now, that's enough to make a sensible person rethink a solo hike after dark.
Thanks for listening. Share this with someone who still plans night hikes alone, and maybe you'll save them from finding out the hard way that being seen matters.